The rain was falling hard against the cracked window pane. It was the kind of morning that made most people stay in bed, but not him. He sat on the edge of his mattress, tying his worn-out shoes. The laces were frayed. The soles had holes, but they were all he had. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air sting his lungs. His reflection in the dusty mirror looked tired, but alive. There was a fire in his eyes, a quiet defiance that whispered, "I am not done yet." Outside, the streets were slick and empty. Puddles reflected the dim glow of the streetlights. Every step he took splashed against the silence, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat in his chest. He walked toward the bus stop, his hoodie soaked through. A few people stared, wondering why someone would be out in this weather, but he did not care. He had made a promise to himself that he would never run away from hard days again. When the bus arrived, he climbed aboard and sat near the back. The driver glanced at him through the mirror and said, "Tough morning to be out, huh?" He smiled faintly and replied, "Every morning is tough until you decide to win it." As the city rolled past the fogged windows, he thought about how far he had come. There were times he had nothing, times when the weight of failure pressed so hard on his chest that breathing felt like a punishment. But through all of it, one voice kept him alive, a voice deep inside that said, "I am going to win." It did not shout. It did not demand attention. It whispered, quietly, persistently, like the beating of a heart that refuses to stop. When he reached his stop, he stepped off the bus and walked toward the small gym at the end of the block. The neon sign flickered, half the letters burned out. It was not fancy. It smelled of rust and effort, of sweat and dreams. He opened the door and was greeted by the hum of old machines, the sound of iron colliding with iron, and the faint echo of determination hanging in the air. He walked to the locker room, placed his bag down, and stared at himself again in the cracked mirror. He saw the scars on his knuckles, the faint bruise on his shoulder, the marks of persistence carved into his skin. He whispered again, "I am going to win." And this time it felt different. Not like a dream, not like a wish, but like a decision. He wrapped his hands, tightening the tape until it bit into his skin. Every pull was a reminder of what he had endured. Every motion was a silent declaration that he would no longer be the man who stopped when it hurt. When he stepped into the training area, the coach raised an eyebrow. "Back again?" the coach asked. He nodded. The coach grinned. "You must really love punishment," he smiled. "I know, I just hate losing." The bell rang. He faced his opponent, taller, stronger, faster. Sound of gloves meeting flesh filled the air. Each hit was heavy, each movement sharp, but he refused to retreat. He had fallen too many times before to let this one break him. He remembered every night he had gone to bed hungry. Every morning he had woken up in doubt. Every voice that told him he was not enough. Each memory became a weapon, each scar a reason to keep fighting. When the bell rang again, signaling the end of the round, he staggered back, panting, his vision blurry. The coach leaned over the ropes and said, "You are getting hit too much. You are going to lose if you keep this up." He looked up, his breathing ragged but his eyes alive. Then he said something the coach did not expect. He said, "I am not here to avoid getting hit. I am here to learn how to keep standing." The coach froze for a moment, then slowly nodded, a proud smile forming beneath his sweat-soaked brow. The bell rang again. And this time he stepped forward with purpose. Not out of anger, not out of desperation, but out of belief. Because he had finally understood that winning is not about never falling. It is about refusing to stay down when you do. He threw his first punch with all his strength. The impact echoed through the gym. The crowd that had gathered grew quiet. Something had changed. You could see it in his posture, in the way his shoulders squared, in the light burning in his eyes. It was not arrogance. It was faith, the kind that only comes from enduring pain and surviving it. The fight was not over, but deep inside he already knew the outcome. Because this time he was no longer fighting the opponent in front of him. He was fighting the one within. And for the first time in his life, he knew who would win. He whispered the words one more time, each syllable clear, deliberate, alive with conviction. "I am going to win." The bell echoed once more. He lifted his gloves, ready for what came next. He lifted his gloves, ready for whatever came next. The next round began with the sound of the bell slicing through the thick air. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes, but he refused to blink. His legs trembled, his ribs ached, yet he pressed forward. Each strike that landed against him was a reminder that progress hurts. That victory demands a price, and he was willing to pay it. The crowd's murmurs faded. All he could hear now was his breath, steady and deliberate, and the echo of his heart screaming from within, "You have fought too long to quit now." The punches came faster, sharper. He slipped one, count another. His focus narrowed until time itself seemed to slow. Every motion became instinct, every second a battle between pain and purpose. He took another hit, hard, right across the jaw. The world tilted for a moment. His knees buckled. But before he could fall, something stronger than pain caught him. It was memory, it was love. It was the promise he made to himself on nights when no one believed he could rise again. He gritted his teeth and steadied his stance. Blood ran down his lip, but his eyes never left his target. And with a breath that came from the very core of his being, he swung. The glove connected. A clean, perfect sound cut through the room, the sound of power meeting purpose. His opponent stumbled, surprised. The crowd gasped. And for the first time, he saw fear in the other man's eyes. It was not fear of being hurt. It was fear of someone who refused to surrender. He pressed forward again, each movement deliberate, each breath a declaration. He was no longer just fighting to win a match. He was fighting to prove that every time life knocked him down, he had risen stronger. The bell rang again, ending the round. He stood there, chest heaving, sweat glistening under the harsh lights. The coach shouted from the corner, "You have one more round. Can you finish it?" He smiled, slow and calm. "I finished it the moment I refused to give up." The final round began. Both fighters moved in silence, their bodies heavy with exhaustion. But his movements were sharper now, driven by something unbreakable inside him. He dodged, weaved, and struck back, not with rage, but with control. Every punch told a story, every breath carried meaning. Then in one fluid motion, he landed a blow that sent his opponent staggering backward. The crowd erupted, but he did not hear them. All he could feel was stillness, peace, the quiet kind that only comes when you finally live up to your own promise. He stepped back and lowered his gloves. The referee began to count, but he already knew the outcome. He had not just won a fight, he had conquered his fear, his doubt, his excuses. When the final bell rang, the room exploded with noise. Cheers, claps, shouts, but he heard none of it. He turned to his corner where his coach waited with pride in his eyes. And for the first time in his life, he smiled not because others approved, but because he did. The announcer raised his arm, declaring him the winner. But victory felt different this time. It was not glory that filled his heart. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the pain that taught him discipline, for the struggle that revealed his strength, for the losses that built his resilience. He looked out into the crowd and saw faces, some cheering, some doubting, some inspired. And he realized that this was more than a win in the ring. It was a message to everyone watching, that no matter who you are, no matter where you begin, you can rise, you can fight back, you can win. As he stepped out of the ring, he felt the cool air rush over his skin. The night was still young, the city lights flickering like stars scattered across wet pavement. He walked outside, his body bruised but his spirit unshaken. Across the street, he saw a young boy shadowboxing in the reflection of a store window. The boy looked at him wide-eyed, then mimicked his stance. He smiled and nodded, and the boy smiled back, throwing a playful punch into the air. That was the moment he understood something profound. Winning was not just about the result. It was about becoming the person who inspires others to believe that they can too. He looked up at the dark sky, the rain beginning to fall again. Each drop felt cool, refreshing, alive. And under that endless sky, he whispered to himself, not as a dream this time, but as a truth carved deep into his soul. I am going to win, in life, in every battle that tries to break me. Then he turned, and with the same quiet determination that had carried him this far, he walked down the street, toward the unknown, toward the next challenge, toward the rest of his life. Because the fight might end in the ring, but the winning, the real winning, never stops. He lifted his gloves, ready to face the storm that awaited him in the next round. The air inside the gym was electric. Every spectator leaned forward, sensing that something had shifted. This was no longer just a fight, it was a transformation happening in real time. The bell rang. He moved with focus, his movements sharp yet fluid. Each dodge was deliberate. Each strike was controlled. His body screamed in pain, but his spirit roared louder. He could hear the faint voice of his younger self somewhere in the back of his mind. The boy who once gave up too soon, who once believed life was unfair, who once thought dreams belonged only to others. That boy was still there, watching, but this time the man was leading. He blocked a heavy blow and countered with precision. The impact jolted through his arm, but he did not flinch. He had learned to find strength inside the pain, to find purpose inside the struggle. The round dragged on, seconds stretching into eternities. Sweat poured down his face, his breath coming in steady waves of effort and will. He could feel his opponent weakening, not from fatigue, but from disbelief. Because how do you defeat someone who refuses to surrender? The bell rang again. Both fighters stood frozen for a moment. Neither spoke. Both understood this was not about winning a trophy. It was about reclaiming identity. He walked to his corner. The coach handed him water, his eyes glowing with respect. "You have already won," the coach said quietly. He smiled faintly and shook his head. "No," he replied, "I am still winning." The final round began. The air felt heavier. Every sound, the crowd, the bell, the scuff of shoes, blended into a single rhythm of destiny. He moved differently now, not faster, but freer. His mind was clear, his fear gone. Every step forward felt like a statement. I am no longer the man who doubts himself. He could feel power surging from within, not from muscle, but from memory, from every tear, every fall, every sleepless night spent believing that one day it would all be worth it. The last exchange of blows came fast, a hook, a cross, a left to the ribs, then a final right hand that landed clean, solid. Final, the sound echoed through the room like thunder. His opponent fell to one knee, breathing hard, eyes wide. The referee moved forward to count, but the fighter already knew what mattered most. He had not won because someone else fell. He had won because he had finally stood tall. When the count reached 10, the crowd erupted. The noise was deafening, but within him there was only stillness. He closed his eyes and whispered again, "I told you, I am going to win." He turned toward the corner, his coach smiling through tears. The man who had once doubted everything now stood victorious, not because of power, but because of perseverance. When the lights dimmed and the people began to leave, he stayed behind. He sat in the center of the ring, tracing his fingers over the rough canvas, the same floor that had witnessed his failures and his rise. He thought of his mother who had told him, "Son, if you believe you can, the world will have no choice but to follow." He thought of his late father, whose silence had once felt like absence, but now felt like guidance. He looked up at the flickering light above and smiled. He was bruised, exhausted, yet more alive than ever before. He stood up slowly and walked toward the door. Outside, the city had gone quiet. The streets glowed under pale moonlight. He could see his reflection in the wet pavement, not the boy who doubted, but the man who became unstoppable. Cars passed by, honking faintly, the world moving on as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. He walked down the street with his gym bag over his shoulder, feeling the weight of the gloves, feeling the meaning behind every fight. He understood now that "I am going to win" was never about a single moment. It was a way of life, a promise renewed each morning, a truth whispered every night before sleep. He passed a small shop window and stopped. Inside, a television replayed his match, the same fight that had nearly broken him. A small crowd stood watching, their faces filled with awe. He smiled faintly, because he remembered when no one had been watching at all. As he turned to leave, he saw a young woman outside, training alone in the rain with worn-out gloves. Her movements were unsteady, her punches slow, but her eyes, they burned with the same fire. She looked up and recognized him. Their eyes met. She hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "I want to be like you one day." He shook his head and replied, "No. Be better, and remember, do not wait for the world to believe in you. Say it now, and say it until you live it." He pointed to his chest, then to hers. "Say it." Her lips trembled and steadied as she whispered, "I'm going to win." He smiled, turned away, and disappeared into the rain, his figure fading into the rhythm of a city that never slept. Behind him, the girl kept training, her punches cutting through the cold air, her voice growing stronger each time she repeated the words, "I am going to win." And somewhere deep inside that endless night, a truth echoed louder than thunder. That victory does not belong to the chosen few. It belongs to the ones who refuse to stop fighting. And as the rain washed over the city, it carried that promise with it. A promise whispered by every dreamer who dares to believe, "I am going to win." He could see his reflection in the wet pavement. Not the same man who had entered that ring hours ago, but someone reborn through his own fire. He walked down the street, each step echoing softly against the concrete. The world around him seemed calmer, as if it too recognized the quiet strength in his stride. He passed by the small bakery that used to close before he finished training, and for the first time, he saw the light still on. He stopped, smiled, and bought a single loaf of bread. The woman behind the counter looked at his bruised face and asked gently, "A tough night?" He smiled and replied, "No, it was a winning night." She nodded, not understanding the depth behind those words, but sensing their truth. As he stepped outside, he tore a piece of the bread and tasted it. It was warm, simple, real. The same way victory should feel. He walked toward the hill overlooking the city, where the skyline shimmered like 1,000 dreams trying to be born. He thought about the people who had told him to quit, the friends who had left, the nights when hope felt like a distant star. All of it had brought him here, to this exact moment of peace and pride. He sat down on the cold grass, placed his gloves beside him, and looked at his hands, scarred, rough, but honest. These were not the hands of luck. They were the hands of persistence. And in that stillness, he understood something deeper. Winning was never about defeating others. It was about defeating the weaker version of yourself that keeps whispering, "You cannot." He leaned back and closed his eyes. The wind brushed across his face and the city lights flickered below. He whispered softly to himself, "I am going to win again tomorrow," because true victory, he realized, is not a single moment of triumph. It is the choice to rise every single day, no matter what life throws at you. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, he stood, stretched, and smiled. The night that had once felt endless had become his beginning. He picked up his gloves, looked toward the rising sun, and said one final time, "I am going to win."